Hi guys, first video lecture from me. It's gonna be about the Cold War. Exciting. Um, I have 15 minutes only to record this for you, so I'm gonna talk at my normal pace, but because this is a video, if you wanna pause this, if you wanna slow it down, you are welcome to do this and kind of do it that way and work at your own pace, okay? So today what I wanna talk to you about is hotspots of the Cold War. So first of all, just in case you aren't kind of picking up on this from what you've read so far about the Cold War, it's called a Cold War because the two primary adversaries in this conflict, right, the United States and the Soviet Union, don't actually fight each other. We never actually go to war actively together, but there are a lot of associated conflicts where there is actual military action all over the world during this time period. And that's what I mean when I say hotspots. So my notes here, if we were doing this in class, I would give you a map, you could color in the countries, and then describe the details of this. I'm gonna allow you to do that at your own pace in your notes. I do think it might be beneficial to make a timeline as we go through this. I'm not going to talk about these events in the correct chronological order, but it may be helpful to you to start kind of looking at how can I build a series of cause and effects that have to do with the Cold War to really help you understand what is the evolution of the United States policy, how is our military response maybe changing as time goes on in some of these hotspots, and again, be able to identify what some of these events are kind of based on where they fall in time. So for each one of these hotspots, I'm first going to give you a primary source. I would pause the video at that point so you can read it on your own. I'll just flash it up here for a second or two so that I can stay within my 15-minute time frame. And then we'll talk about where it is and kind of what's going on there. All right, I've never done this particular lesson as a lecture. I've only ever done it as a discussion. So we'll see how this goes. First, here is our source. So I'm going to just leave it up here for a second or two. You can read it on your own. What I would be maybe noticing if I were reading this was, what country are we talking about here? The USSR. What's the date? 1962. Talking about evacuating weapons from Turkey, talking about offensive weapons. If you are picking up on some things that maybe point you towards this country, you're on the right track. This is Cuba. This document is directly related to the Cuba Missile Crisis of 1962, as close as the United States really ever came to directly confronting the Soviet Union in this particular conflict, and probably as close as the United States has come to World War III in the modern era. Our president, of course, during this particular conflict is one young John F. Kennedy, who we will hear more about in the chapters ahead, but who is, I like that your textbook kind of points out that he is an old school Cold Warrior in a lot of ways here. Moving to our next source, this one is a photo. So again, I'll give you a moment to kind of look at it, read the caption, and see if you can figure out what's going on here. Friend. If you are a fan of the band Rage Against the Machine, and really who isn't, you may have seen this photo before. This was used on one of their album covers. What's going on in this photo is this is a monk who is, you can see the caption says this is a picture of self-immolation, which is exactly what it sounds like. This man has literally set himself on fire. You may have also noticed the year, 1963, maybe noticed some of the other kind of details in the background of this image. This image is from this country, which is Vietnam. So the United States will really get involved in Vietnam much more directly as we get kind of further into period 8, as we get more into like the late 1960s. But our actual first kind of entry into this country goes all the way back to the 1950s, when it is still a French colony, as part of this whole larger area that's called Indochina. All of the countries around Vietnam are part of the French colonial empire. We are supporting France to keep their colonial possessions, and supporting a government there that is capitalist and Western, but that is really creating some problems with the people who are native to this country. In this image, this man was protesting the treatment of Buddhists in this country. Vietnam is a primarily Buddhist nation at this time, but the president of the country, who was kind of supported by the United States, a man named Godin Diem, was Catholic. He had been educated in the West, and he was really forcing his kind of religious views on a lot of other people, or limiting religious freedom, which is one of the reasons why a civil war is kind of brewing in Vietnam at this time. So when you think about presidents who are associated with Vietnam, you actually first want to think about this guy. If you don't recognize him, this is Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike. He was a general in World War II, a war hero of World War II, and he's elected after Harry Truman. And starting in the 1950s, he is the one who starts bringing military advisors from the United States to Vietnam. A small number of troops are going to be on the ground, not to fight, but basically to advise the South Vietnamese army as the civil conflict is brewing. Kennedy is also going to be involved in sending troops there. And then the presidents who we probably most associate with Vietnam, we haven't even heard about yet in this chapter. Actually, I take that back. Richard Nixon got a little mention at the very beginning of this chapter, and Lyndon Johnson, who will be Kennedy's successor after Kennedy's assassination, is also much more visibly responsible for sending troops into this conflict. Country number 3. Pause and read. I also paused my recording just now because it felt really weird to just sit here and let it record with dead air. All right, so if I were reading the source, I would obviously always pay attention to the source line first. I see John Foster Dulles and John Allison, a telegram being sent to the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and Assistant Secretary Dean Rusk. I recognize these names from the chapter. I know that these are Americans. This is 1950. And then I'm going to read about what's actually happening here. So there's a possibility of attack. A disastrous chain of events leading most probably to world war. We suggest that the United Nations Security Council might call for action. So for me, this is the big clue with this source, because I know that none of these conflicts are really wars in the official sense of Congress actually declaring war on an adversary. But I know that one of them that came closest was a UN police action. And that is the conflict that took place here. This is, well, what's highlighted here is North Korea, but the whole peninsula here is the Korean Peninsula. So again, this is a civil conflict that is brewing in the years after World War II, where part of the country, the North, is embracing communism under their leader Kim Il-sung, and the southern part of the country under their capitalist leader Syngman Rhee is trying to resist that. So these two countries have split apart at this point when the United States gets involved in 1950, and the North is starting to attack the South. So our president who is involved here is this guy. This is Harry Truman. Look at his little glasses. He's so cute. And Truman got a lot of criticism for this conflict, as you may remember from the reading. The United States sends in military troops. We occupy all the way up almost to the Chinese border, and then kind of push a little bit too far, and China strikes back, which was one of the major fears of the United States at this time. China had also just undergone a civil war and had embraced communism on its own under Mao Zedong, and Truman also had received a lot of criticism for losing China to the communists immediately after World War II. And as the USSR is seen to kind of be growing in power and influence in Eastern Europe. China is a really interesting example because your textbook talks about like these client states that are set up along the Eastern Soviet border. So countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland are all directly dependent upon Moscow for all of their leadership. All of their governance comes from there. So they are independent, but they're part of this larger Soviet Union, right? Which is almost like kind of a federation of states. China's really interesting. China remains completely independent, but also is not that interested in doing what Moscow tells it to do. Mao is his own dictator. They have their own kind of brand of communism, which persists today. China is still a communist country today, and ends up maybe not being as much of a concern for the United States, at least militarily during this time, except for in this conflict. Country number 4. I'll give you another moment to pause and read. Right, so first of all, again, I see Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1959, and this phrase United Arab Republic shows up in here a number of times. So this is related, again, to what is essentially a civil conflict when it first begins, a growing nationalist movement within countries like this one, which is, of course, Egypt, to try to throw off the colonial rule that had been there. Egypt was a British colony during this time, and reassert sovereignty for the people who are indigenous to that country. If a lot of this is kind of sounding familiar to you, thinking about maybe the Atlantic Charter that Churchill and Roosevelt signed at the very beginning of World War II, or even the ideas from President Wilson in the League of Nations, this idea of self-determination for countries after a war is over, I'm hearing it too. There's an interesting kind of continuity in trying to understand where these conflicts come from. Self-determination sounds really good, but for a lot of countries that have colonial control, this is a really troubling thing for them. Our president here in this particular conflict is, again, Dwight D. Eisenhower. England is a lot more involved in this particular conflict than the United States is, but I still think it's a good one to know about. And here we have country number 5. I'm noticing that my webcam is cutting off some of the words here. I apologize for that. Again, Jacopo Arbenz, 1954. The other thing that you are maybe seeing in this source is the United Fruit Company, this idea of the United States having business interests in this country. This is the country of Guatemala. So the United States doesn't have a real military or political concern here, except that we own a lot of banana plantations in Guatemala and a whole bunch of other countries in this region as well, right? This is where the term banana republics comes from, before the store ever started putting out fancy pants and sweaters and stuff like that. So in Guatemala, Jacopo Arbenz had risen to power as a nationalist hero representing poor people in this country, and was reaching out to the communist governments for support. And this was seen as a direct threat, not to the United States' safety militarily, but to our economic interests. So again, this is a place where the United States intervenes in order to have him overthrown and a more capitalist, although maybe not more democratically inclined leader installed. And again, this is another development during Eisenhower's term in office. Country number 6. I'm not even going to say this much about this one because you should hopefully have listened to a long podcast about this particular country and conflict. Yesterday, we have a source here from the CIA. We have mentions of the Shah and Tehran. This is, of course, the CIA assisted overthrow of the Shah of Iran, or rather installation of the Shah after Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected, and again seen as a threat to U.S. economic interests, particularly as they relate to oil. And we have Eisenhower again. It's interesting. A lot of historians maybe don't, or history students maybe don't associate Eisenhower as much with the Cold War as later presidents, but you can see that a lot of these developments are definitely happening during his time. Think about also what this means about the Eisenhower Doctrine and how that is different from the Truman Doctrine and how it sort of represents a shift in America's policies during this time period. Maybe it would be helpful to write in your notes what you think that shift is. Country number 7. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, this is a letter to their children, 1953. You don't have a lot of clues about what country this is from unless you recognize these two individuals' names. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are American. They are accused of being communist spies during this period, and they are actually put to death by electric chair by the US government. We're going to talk more in class tomorrow about the Red Scare, the second Red Scare in the United States, and how that is influencing American culture and society. And we'll learn a lot more about that society in the chapters ahead. But I think it's interesting to think about whether the United States itself maybe counts as kind of a hotspot for the Cold War. We're not fighting with guns or tanks or airplanes or something like that. But there does seem to be an internal fight that's going on, sometimes against our own people during the same period. And with that, I got 10 seconds left. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll talk to you soon.